So I first encountered the Pentacles when I was about 14 or 15 in the Mathers edition of the Key of Solomon, which I think is where most people first encounter them, right? And it was very clear to me as soon as I saw them, there was like a buzz, and I was like, oh, this is the good stuff, okay, right? Much better than the, like, you know, 1980s, 90s, like, pop Wicca, which is what I had access to, right? The story's taking place in, like, 1992 in Amish country, right? So I do not have access to very good books where I live, right? But I found the Key of Solomon, right? And inside, so the Key of Solomon has 2 books, a book 1 and a book 2. Between the 2 books, but in neither, right, is a book full of pentacles. So a pentacle is a kind of a wizard diagram. I'm just going to sort of show you a couple, so, like, we all know, like, sort of what I'm talking about, right? So here, I would say, find a good one. So this is the seal, I call this one the Seal of Sheba. This is the second pentacle of Venus. This is perhaps my favorite, and I think of this one as, like, just a very archetypal pentacle, right? So the pentacles, you can think of them in a lot of different ways, right? So first of all, the word pentacle, it's actually not related to the word pentagram. So even though that one did have a pentagram on them, most of them don't. They have other kinds of geometry on them, other kinds of figures, and they're covered in Hebrew words, right? Sacred names, right? And so the word pentacle, it's more related to pendant, and that's the way we normally think of them today, is as wearable amulets, but they're also good for a lot of, you can use them in a lot of other ways, right? So the primary way I think about them when I teach them is as a sort of, like, portal through which you are communicating with the spirits that are named on the pentacle. But another way to think about them is as a diagram of a ritual, right? So Solomonic magic, what is it, right? That's a complicated question, actually, and one I fight about on the internet a lot, right? But to me, Solomonic magic is any kind of magic that claims that, like, its authority is coming from Solomon, the legendary magician king of ancient Israel, right? And for me, a question I often see on the internet is like, what spirit should I contact to learn Solomonic magic? That's what internet people sound like in my head, right? And I feel like the answer to that question is very obvious. It's Solomon, right? And so that's, like, the first pillar of my method of working with Solomonic magic, is that I work directly with the spirit of Solomon, the magician king. For reasons I do not understand, not everyone does that, and I'm not saying they're doing it wrong, right? I just think it's a very easy on-road. And I will say that in general, in almost any kind of magic I do, I'm always going to work with sort of, like, the legendary authors and teachers of it. So when I do magic from the Greek magical papyri, I also work with, like, directly, and even though we don't know their names, like, the spirits of, right, the authors and teachers and preservers of this lore, right? And similarly, when I work with Solomonic magic, I work with Solomon the magician king and with the authors and preservers of the Key of Solomon, which are the particular pentacles I'm talking about in this book, and particularly with Samuel Mathers and his wife Moina Mathers, right? Who I think does not get the credit she deserves. I talk about her a lot in the book. So for people who don't know, Samuel Mathers was one of the founders of the Golden Dawn, right? He wrote the edition of the Key of Solomon that, like, most people, that's the first one they encounter. And I will say, until 10 or 15 years ago, it was really the only one you could ever encounter, especially in English, right? Like, but even reading Latin, it was hard to get. Even reading Italian, right? It was hard to get your hands on other manuscripts, right? So most people are familiar with the Mathers manuscript. But if you watch, like, a trajectory of Mathers' career, you'll notice there's, like, this one year where suddenly he got really good at Hebrew. Well, that's the year that he married Mina Bergson, right, who is the sister of the philosopher Henri Bergson and the granddaughter of Temeril Bergson, who's a really important figure, let's say, right, in the founding of Neo-Hasidism, right? In particular, Temeril Bergson was the only woman in that sort of milieu who was granted the title of Reb, of teacher, right? And that's Mina Bergson's grandmother. So I think, like, perhaps more of this book on Hebrew magic is Mina Bergson changes her name to Moina Mathers when she gets married, right? And I think there is more of her influence in that edition of the Key of Solomon than is generally credited, right? And I think there are a lot of reasons why we don't talk about the Pentacles as Hebrew magic, right? But indeed, are pentacles Jewish or not? Perhaps open to debate, but they are covered in Hebrew, and a lot of magicians, for reasons like I'm not gonna throw around, but I think we can all make some guesses as to why, we don't talk about that, and a lot of magicians don't seem to feel like it matters what is written on these pentacles, but they're magic made out of words, and as soon as I encountered them, that was my first question, like, hey, what does this say? And at the time, like, I mean, I recognized Hebrew, I knew the alphabet, I could maybe, like, sound out words, but I certainly could not read these pentacles. And I assumed somewhere there would be a book that told me what was written on these pentacles. But there was not, right? And for 30 years, I asked around every time, like, hey, what does it say on this pentacle? And sometimes people would be able to translate some of it, right? And some people would say, I don't know, but a lot of people would say it doesn't matter. I think it probably does matter. So eventually, you know, over the years, I just found my own translations, and eventually I just became frustrated and wrote a book of them, right? So that is primarily the second half of this book. Basically, there are 44 pentacles. I walk through every one, and I tell you in great detail what is written on it, what those names mean, and why I think those names are on that pentacle, right? Someone made some choices to put them there. In the course of researching the book, I came to understand that, like, more of it was the Mathers than I originally imagined, right? The pentacles are actually quite different in different manuscripts, right? And you can tell that many of those manuscripts have at least somewhere in their chain of transmission someone who does not have any Hebrew at all. Because sometimes, like, that's not even a letter, that's a squiggle. Like, it is clear. And I know, right? Because my Hebrew wasn't that great either. I know what it looks like when you take a Hebrew pentacle, you do not write Hebrew, and you copy it out of a book. And some of those things aren't letters anymore. A lot of Hebrew letters look suspiciously like other Hebrew. I can see the Jews in the audience, like, nodding with me. Like, there are a lot of Hebrew letters that are actually quite hard to distinguish, especially when they are written by people who don't know Hebrew, right? So there's a lot of digging, and a lot of Mather's pentacle, like, he's making choices, right? And Mathers, like, you know, I think in the modern world, I think it's really, like, popular to kind of shit on Mathers. But, like, Mathers, you know, maybe was not up to what we would consider modern levels of scholarship. It sure would be nice if he knew how a footnote worked and was, like, willing to tell us anything about these choices he made. But, you know, Mathers is looking exclusively at this Christian tradition of Solomonic magic, right? But that's not all the Solomonic magic there is, right? So Solomonic magic is this really complicated tree of different kinds of magic with roots in antiquity, right? And it has a couple of different roots, right? One is it's really coming out of this Hebrew angelology, right? This Hebrew amulet magic. And if you are familiar with other kinds of Hebrew amulet magic, when you look at the pentacles, you're like, oh yeah, that is exactly the same kind of magic as, like, if I go to my rabbi and ask him to write me an amulet, it's going to look like this, right? There's just a structure to them. But there is, in addition, this Babylonian astrotheology component, right? They are a little bit astrological. They're not as astrological as you might imagine. So even though we call them the planetary pentacles, they're not, in their essence, astrological magic, right? The way that you would find in, say, like, the Picatrix, right? Where those are astrological talismans whose goal is to sort of, like, there's this perfect moment in time that you are going to kind of freeze into a talisman so that you can access that time at any point. There are a lot of different ways to categorize magic, right? Agrippa gives us these 3 categories, which I'm not saying I 100% agree with, but they support the point I'm trying to make at this moment, so I'm going to tell you about them, right? So he has 3. The first one he calls natural magic. We might call it, like, sympathetic magic today, right? So that's magic of things that are fully embodied, right? So the magic of stones and plants, and also what we would today call, like, internal energy work, which is embodied in a human body, right? But it's magic where essentially, like, the power of it is coming out of physical things in our material world, right? His next category, Agrippa calls celestial, but we would call astrological magic. Right? So the first category is things that are bound in space. The second category is things that are bound in time. Right? And then he has this third category, which he calls divine, but I might call ideal. Not ideal as in perfect, but ideal as in made out of ideas. Right? So this is the magic of, like, magic words and sacred geometry and other things. They're not bound in space, or in time, this third category of magic. And the Pentacles, like almost all Hebrew magic, right, are really in that third category. So even though we talk about them as planetary, if you look between different manuscripts, you'll see that the same pentacle is sometimes ascribed to different planets. You'll see that occasionally some of them do give some astrological advice on timing, but most of them do not, right? So they are not essentially astrological in nature. Like, their real oomph is coming out of those words, right? And that's why I think it does matter. So when we're making a talisman, right, you can sort of work your talisman in any of those three categories, right? You can choose, like, the appropriate metal, or people have really fetishized metal pentacles recently, but traditionally pentacles are written in ink on parchment, and I actually prefer to make them that way. Not that there's anything wrong with making them out of metal. I will also throw this out there. Some people are like, oh, you can't use a laser cutter. But there is an entire story in the Talmud where Solomon goes on a magical quest to get a magical cutting tool made out of light to hew things. Like, I assure you, some people say it's a magical worm. It depends how you do the translation. It's called the shamir, if you want to look it up. But there's this whole story, so I assure you, if Solomon had a laser cutter, like, you can cut your magical pentacles with a sword made out of light. Like, of course Solomon would be into that, right? But again, more traditionally, it would be to make them on parchment, out of ink. And so in this first category of magic, this natural magic category, right, you can choose appropriate metals or appropriate parchments, like animals from the that are appropriate to the magic you are doing, appropriate inks. One of the reasons I like to make mine on parchment, or often I just make them on paper, is it lets you make them in color. I personally feel like black and white magic is sort of like always a missed opportunity. Like, I will add color to any kind of magic I can get away with coloring. My copy of this, by the way, I have colored in all the pentacles with colored pencils, which I strongly recommend. I think coloring, I did that in Orphic Hymns too, right? They're like coloring book style illustrations. I think coloring, it's a really good way to sort of like force yourself to just like meditatively concentrate on the thing for quite, you know what I mean? It takes quite a while to color in a pentacle if you do a good job, right? And it sort of forces you to really like, in that sort of like Zen mind state, just interact with it. So I do encourage coloring them in, right? So we have this natural magic. You can absolutely like elect the appropriate time, right, to make them, to bring in that astrological or celestial magic, right? But they are in their essence divine magic. And if you don't know what the words are, you can't really access that at all. Like, you can say the name of an angel out loud, maybe, if you can read it in the Hebrew, though I will say, I often see transliterations of these angel names into English that I find a little questionable. That is perhaps not how I would say that word. But a lot of them, it's not at all clear what they say. And I will say, if you really dig into them, I mean, I'm about to say something perhaps controversial. I think there's just mistakes in the Mathers edition. Like, some of those pentacles. So there's one, let me show you, the one with the scorpion on it. It's cool because it has a scorpion on it. This one. Right? This is the one I'm talking about. So you can see it's really only, it's got around the outside, right, around the circumference, those are often called versicles. They're usually portions of Torah verses. And many books will tell you what that one is. So this one says, you will tread on cubs and vipers. Cubs, it's really lion cubs in particular. And you will trample lions and asps. I've spoken to a lot of people, and most people are in agreement with me that probably those are the specific animals being named in this passage. If you read sort of the passage in context, they're probably like totems of specific like political or tribal affinities that this is talking about in the context, right? But it's really like, you will trample on your enemies. Very straightforward, right? But then it's only got one word, right? And it's just repeated 4 times. And Mathers has that word spelled wrong, I think. See this letter? See how much it looks like that letter? Those are not the same letter, though, right? And what Mathers has, not a word. But what I changed it to means military power, right? And so that's what I mean about, like, I think, I have 30 years of experience with these pentacles, so I'm willing to make these claims. But when you really look at them, the ones that don't make any sense, right? I think with very small changes, I think this letter should be this letter that looks similar. Suddenly you get these names that are deeply related to the thing that is going on, right? So I do occasionally correct them. But that's really the second half of this book, as I go through all the pentacles, I sort of explain every single word, and I talk about the kavanot, the like mystic intentions, right? So in Jewish magic broadly, we have this tension, right, between keva and kavana, between ritual precision. Like, you got to say these exact right words in this right exact order, but you can't just go through the motions of saying them. You have to have, like, the magic intention, right? The mystic intention that goes behind them. And there's different kinds of intentions you can build, magical intentions, and sometimes in Hebrew magic those are very complicated. Well, I'm going to intend to read the first letter of each verse, and that is the same that I would have gotten if I read this other verse. So I'm actually going to think about this other verse, right? Complex mystic intentions are a very common feature of Kabbalistic magic. So I provide intentions for every pentacle but two. The two that are like the really, really horrible cursing ones, like, I'm going to ruin the weather and rain down fire from the sky. I did translate that one for you. I did not tell you how to use it. People on the internet are mad about that fact. Like, if you read my Amazon reviews, they'll be like, she doesn't even curse people. I'm like, I could curse you, like, if that's what you're here for, like, that's a weird complaint, right? But except for these two, right, which are both very corrupt. If you look at multiple manuscripts, like, whatever Mathers has, it doesn't make any sense to me, and there's a limit to how willing I am to experiment with that pentacle. You know what I mean? The ones that are like, oh, it makes you happy and rich and everybody loves you, I'll experiment with those. But the ones that are like gonna break the whole world or cause earthquakes, I don't want to experiment with them too much, right? So I translate it and I give some suggestions, but I don't give intentions for those particular two, right? But then after I wrote that book, because that was the book I wanted, again, doesn't it seem weird to you guys that that book didn't exist? Nowhere. I tried really hard to find that book because surely I was not the only one who saw word magic and was like, oh, what does that mean? Turns out harder than you might think to answer that question. Some of it's in code, some manuscripts corrupt. It took some doing, right? But then after I wrote that, I was like, oh, this is not a very accessible book, right? Like, you maybe already had to be deep in the Pentacle nerd hole for that to make any use at all. So the first half of the book, I wrote like an on-ramp into Solomonic magic, right? And so I present what I call the SLM method of Solomonic magic. SLM stands for a lot of different things. It stands for Sara Mastros. It also stands for Samuel Little Mathers. It also, that's how you spell the root of Solomon's name, right, is Shin Lamed Mem. It's the same root as the Hebrew Shalom, which means peace, the Arabic Salam, which also means peace. The root of it actually means to set like the sun. An interesting fact about Semitic languages, which is also true about many Native American languages, is that in Indo-European languages like English, we think about root words as being nouns, right? So it gives you this way of interacting with the world that is very, like, object-oriented, right? But in Semitic languages and in Native American languages, and maybe in other language families, I'm not a linguist, I don't know everything, right? Not that linguists know everything, right? They're verbs, right? And so it gives you this, like, very animist way of interacting with the world when, like, your root conceptions of how you interact with the world are not as objects, but as doings, right? So the root of that word, Shin Lamed Mem, is to set like the sun, right? From there, it also means, like, west, and it also means evening, and so it also means, like, rest, and that is how it comes to mean peace, right? So this root word gives this huge, like, family of interrelated words, right? Which is generally the case with most Hebrew words, that they have what we call a tri-letter, a three-letter root to them, and those roots give rise to these big families of words, right? So SLM is also that, but it is also an acronym. So I said earlier that there were 3 pillars in my method, and that the first one was Solomon. That's the S in SLM. The second one is, you know, honestly, I don't even remember what I said in the book. I went back and forth. It's either logos or language or linguistics. I think in the book I called it logos, but I will tell you I changed my mind about which one of those should be the L many times, right? And that's the second half of the book, like, what are these things? But the third piece of my method, which sadly I find a little lacking in a lot of... Solomonic magic has this reputation for being, like, very, like, fussy, like, old white guy magic, which is weird because, like, it has this reputation for being, like, very Christonormative and very Eurocentric, which is strange because it is neither Christian nor European, Solomonic magic, right? Solomon, not Christian, not European. Solomon's mother is from Africa, right? Like, her name is Bathsheba, the daughter of Sheba. Like, she's from southern Africa, right? So, well, I think we all know how actually things get that reputation that don't belong to those people, right? And as a Jew, I also find that a little ish, right? But the third thing that I want in my magic, and what the M stands for, is magic, right? In the SLM method, we approach this magic as if magic is really, really real, right? As if you can talk to dead people like Solomon the Magician King, and they can teach you things. Like, the angels in these pentacles are actual persons with whom you can have genuine conversations, right? And so that's sort of my complete method, that we work with Solomon the Magician King as our teacher, right? Like, that's who we're learning from, right? That, like, this magic is made out of words, and it matters what those words mean. And again, that's the second half of the book. And magic, right? So the first half of the book, there are some detailed instructions for sort of making contact with Solomon the Magician King, which is really this sort of a similar method that I would use for talking to anybody among the mighty dead, right? So it's built on what, like, is sort of inspired by, like, a Greek Orthodox kind of icon practice, right? So I wish I didn't bring it because I would have had to take it on an airplane. But the icon of Solomon I use is actually not the one on the cover. My publisher and I had some disagreements about it. This is my preferred icon of Solomon, right? Which is like, so this is a Russian Orthodox icon here. It's in the front piece. That's the one I use, but you know, there's the reasons I like that one, I will say, is one, he is visibly biracial, which is a thing I like, right? In a lot of Pentacles, he's very, very white, and it's not my favorite, right? Two, he's young, right? A lot of times you get, like, old, wise Solomon, which is fine, but I don't know, I like young, rough and tumble, kind of scrappy magician Solomon. That's the one I'm looking for, right? I like that it has the Holy Temple on it. That icon's in, I believe, Old Church Slavonic, but it's this really fancy font, and I have yet to find anybody who can confirm for me what it says. But on Greek icons in similar ones, it says that wisdom hath built her house, she has hewn out her 7 pillars. I like that the icon portrays the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, by the way, Yerushalayim, right? It's that same root at the end, the house of Salem, right? The house of peace, sometimes the house of Solomon, but also the house of Salem is the name for Venus evening star. Remember I said that in its core that root meant evening, right? It particularly means Venus evening star, a spirit close to my heart, right? And close to Solomon's heart as well, if you read carefully. There is a way to read it. This is not how I read this myth, but there's a way to read the myth of the Queen of Sheba, where the Queen of Sheba is Venus evening star, right? Like, there's a metaphoric way to read that story. But I understand her to be an actual person. I said before that his mother's name meant Bathsheba. I don't understand her to be literally the daughter of the Queen of Sheba. I understand that to be like a ceremonial type. Okay, I have this complex personal mythology that I don't normally talk about in public, but it's hot and I did a lot of walking today, so my brain's a little fried, so I'll just say it. Like, I believe Solomon's mother to have been like, so this is I want to be clear, this is just my personal mythology, take it or leave it, I don't care, right? It is consistent with other mythology, right? So I would say that Solomon's mother was like specifically sent as a sort of like witch spy to infiltrate the court of David, to seduce David, and to secure that the inheritance of the throne of Israel was also the inheritor of the throne of Sheba, right? Like, I don't think that was accidental, right? That being said, that's some wacky stuff. I will also throw out there for, like, to now undercut my mythology a little bit. The Sheva in Bathsheba is spelled slightly differently than Sheba, the country, in Hebrew, but they share the same root, both of which means the number 7. I can count 7, right? Which is, you know, associated with a lot of things, right? So you could understand her name to mean, like, daughter of the Sabbath. That's what the rabbis would tell you her name means, right? But Bathsheba, I will tell you, and Melika Sheva, right, both, the Queen of Sheba, is an Egyptian title that means Queen of Stars, right? And it's a name for a kind of, like, astrological priestess. I don't think that's a mistake, I don't think that's accidental that the Queen of Sheba just happens to have the same title as a high astrological priestess. I think that's implicit in that story. So I think the 7 in that name is really referring to the 7 planets, and it's talking about that combination, right? That Solomon is coming from this name magic paradigm, right? What we would call, I guess, speech action theory, that there are certain kinds of things that when you say them, the saying of them makes them true. So when I say I promise, the words themselves are the action, right? That's called speech action, right? And like magic words function in sort of that same linguistic category, right? So it's this marriage between Solomon and Sheba, between this sort of like word magic, this speech action magic, and this astrological time-based magic, which I think is really interesting. Right, so those are the 3 pillars, and then right in the first half of the book, I just sort of give you this kind of on-ramp. So I walk you through making contact with Solomon, the Magician King. For most people, I find the easiest place to get first contact with the spirit is in your dreams. So there's a series of dream incubations. Dream incubation is like programming in advance what kind of dream you're going to have. It's a very, very traditional technique. It occurs all over Torah. For example, Solomon incubates a dream at Gibeon, right? Jacob incubates a dream. Some people would say Ezekiel is incubating dreams in the first book of Ezekiel, but that's not how I read it. I think he's having like a straight up vision, like a waking vision, right? So that's the first part. Excuse me. Right? And then the next piece of my magic is really just to look very carefully at the pentacle and read it. It says things on it, like there are actually instructions on them, right? And so when read properly, I said this before, a pentacle is a diagram of a ritual, right? It's telling you who are you going to summon and where. And you can imagine doing that like in a little tiny pentacle, right, is a diagram for what is, you know, as a kid, when I thought about magic, that image of like a wizard in a tower with like a giant circle, and he's all doing it in like Hebrew and Greek and candles and whatever, I was into that. And that's Solomonic magic, right? That's really what we're talking about when we say Solomonic magic. We mean like the cool wizard in a tower kind, right? And they are diagrams for how you can set them up. So that's another way to think about these pentacles, right? Either in a like imaginary sense, or you can genuinely set up big pentacles, right? I don't see people do this very often. We can take a pentacle. We do it sometimes in my coven. We will take a pentacle and draw it. 10 feet is about as big as we can get a circle in my basement. That's just how big my basement is, right? And I really recommend that. It's really fun. So that's sort of the next piece. And then the last part is to really just call the divine names. So Solomonic pentacles, overwhelmingly, almost all of them have a quote from Torah around the outside, which usually is like pretty clear the relationship between that quote and what the pentacle is supposed to do, especially sometimes if you read the surrounding context of that passage, right? Then there are a number of divine names for the God of Israel, right? Different ones. Everybody's got their favorites. I will say my favorite name for the God of Israel is El Shaddai. Shaddai is a really, really old name for the God of Israel. It's the name that the matriarchs and patriarchs use, right? We don't entirely know what it means. Remember what I said about 3-letter roots giving rise to big families? Well, here are some other words that are in that family. Mountain, breast, testicle, wild place, and demon. And that's my kind of God, right? Like tits and balls and demons and mountains. I know that God. That's my God. I'm there for that. Right? So that's my favorite. But they have different names, and in the book I really talk a lot. So when I talk about these divine names, I'll give you all kinds of different like commentary about like, well, this rabbi says that when we use this name it means blah blah blah, as opposed to this guy says that's such and such. And that's how a book on 44 Pentacles becomes 280 pages long, right? So I think I'm going to stop now and take some questions from the audience. Yes.
In regards to the actual pentacles and the inscriptions, if we're not entirely sure if the actual inscriptions are correct, how do we know that it is actually doing what we actually intend and not something else, because it's not quite clear.
So my experience of, so I'm going to just say her question a little later. She's asking, like, if the pentacles are corrupt and we're not quite sure what the words are supposed to be, like, how do you know that it's right? Like, how do you know that this pentacle is going to do what you want it to do, right? And my experience of making them, this is just my personal experience, is that when you make them, right, and you sort of build magic power in them, right, you're sort of like turning it like a crank, like a machine, right? A pentacle, I think you should think of it as a magical machine, where you are just sort of pushing in energy, and it's going to like turn some gears and work. And you can kind of feel, my experience is you can feel that like the gears are rusty, right? And you really got to push, right? And then eventually it'll start to smooth out. And so if you suspect that one is wrong, and how do you know that one is wrong? You know that one is wrong because the words that are in it don't make any sense. Like, either they're just not words, like that's not a word, right? Or they're like, sometimes, how do I say this? They're not a construction that you would expect. Like, there's certain, in any language, right? Like, if you saw an English word that was like WXVVQ, you'd be like, that is not an English word. That's not how English works. And Hebrew, because it's not written with vowels, it does have more flexibility. Like most, I would say, if you take 3 random Hebrew letters, I would say approximately half of those are going to be a word, right? But when you look at them and you're like, this doesn't make any sense, the first thing I do is I look at, like, there are certain, just like in English, right? You can imagine that, like, B's and D's get mixed up, or like P's and Q's. Like, there are certain substitutions. And I look at them and I'm like, huh, if that het was actually a hey, would this be a word? Yes. And does that word directly relate to the meaning of this pentacle? Yes. So I change it and I try it. And my experience just is that as a magician, like, you can feel whether it's working or not, right? Like, the ones where they don't work, you really, I mean, look, as a magician, you can make anything work. You could draw some squiggles, and if you push enough power, right, you can use those other 2 categories. You can use your innate power as a magician, right? If you've got the right metal, you're calling the planetary spirits to help you, like, you can make it work. But at that point, have you really made a pentacle? I would say you've just made like an amulet that happens to be decorated as if it looks like a pentacle, but you're not really taking advantage of the pentacle. But my experience is that you can really feel the difference between the ones that were like the gears catch nice and smooth and like they run, and the other kind where you really have to force them. And if you pay attention, especially if you pay attention and are Hebrew literate, you can feel like which words are the ones where they're catching, and you can just like delicately move them around until they work. So that's my experience, but I know that's not the like definitive answer you want.
Thank you.
But I'm going to say something else. So in the course of writing this book, right, so there's not much of this in this book because I sort of discovered it pretty late in the process. There is a previously unpublished and, in fact, largely unknown Hebrew manuscript of these pentacles, with what appears to be an entirely Hebrew chain of transmission, right? And it is much, much cleaner. And it has way more words. And it has explanations. So something that's important to understand in Christian grimoire magic, right? I talked about this tree with all these different roots. Well, for a while in late antiquity, right, in Greek-speaking late antiquity, right, because Greece has really conquered a lot of places, right, at this point, that Solomonic tree is sort of all coming together to be one trunk. And then it splits back out. And we have this Christian one in Europe, but there's also a fully like parallel Jewish Solomonic magic and a fully parallel Muslim Solomonic magic. And in Christian Europe, these texts were borderline illegal. And that's one of the reasons that when we look in Christian grimoires, there's no like context, because they're never going to say like, oh, I learned this from such and such, because citing sources is the same as naming names. But that's not a problem in the Jewish community where this magic isn't illegal. Like, maybe a magician is like weird and you don't want your daughter to marry a magician because he's kind of a weirdo, right? But you're not going to like burn him at the stake. Like, he's a perfectly legitimate member of the community. And so the Jewish one is like, my name is Isaac Zekel. My father's name is such and such. I live in Worms. I copied this manuscript from Judah Perez, who lives in London, and he got it from such and such. And in the margins, Isaac, the scribe, will be like, well, this manuscript says this, but this other manuscript says such and such, and I think blah, 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 blah. And there's just a much more commentary. So another way that we know they're right is we do have a much cleaner chain of transmission in this Hebrew text, which I am in the process of translating, and will be out, I'm going to say probably late 2025. I'm going to turn a manuscript in a couple months. And it's a shockingly long time, by the way, from when I finish writing a book to putting a book on a shelf is much longer than I appreciated it was before I started writing books, right? So that's another way that we know is we've got this much cleaner transmission, which is cleaner because everybody doing the copying speaks the language that they are copying. So it's just a much, much more sophisticated. And you can tell because there's more words. And you don't, in this game of, in what in the States we would call whisper down the lane, I don't know what they call it here, right? Chinese whispers, right? Where you copy it down. Like, you don't gain information, right? You come out with less than you put in. So there's way less letters in Mather's edition, and in really all of the Christian manuscripts, right? There's just less than there is in this Hebrew manuscript. So if anybody does read Hebrew, you can now, like, I talked to the library that it was in, you can read the entire manuscript at the National Library of Israel website in Hebrew. But it'll be out in translation late next. Tell is just by cross-referencing between manuscripts. And you can talk to Solomon and ask his advice. Like, that's what I did a lot of times, and he gave good advice. More questions? Rob?
I was interested in you talking about the potential for blowing the pentacles up to sort of like a size we can stand in and occupy.
Uh-huh.
And I've often thought like the line between a pentacle and the ritual circles that we find in Solomonic magic is really, like, I don't know how firm that line is. I just wondered if you had thoughts about that.
I mean, the word pentacle means pendant. So technically, if we're calling them a pentacle, I think we're talking about them as a wearable talisman. I use them as conjuration circles quite frequently. Not all. I mean, some of them more than others. It's partly about... I'm very opposed to walking on Hebrew names of God. Like, that's a big issue in Jewish magic, right? Like, don't do that. And that concern kind of rules out certain of the pentacles, because there's, like, nowhere to stand. But some of them, when you look at them, like, I think you're saying what I'm saying. Like, when you look at them, you're like, this looks like a conjuration circle. I conjure in them. Like, I conjure the spirits that are in them in those circles. Does it? I mean, it works. I don't know that it works any better than if I had just, done a regular conjuration circle and conjured those spirits. And I will say, because I've been working with the pentacles for a long time, by the time I'm doing them as conjuration circles, like, I sort of have an established relationship with those spirits, so I'm pretty sure I could just summon them in a field. So I guess I don't have a lot of personal experimental data on it, but I certainly think that they are similar in that way, and they're definitely coming out of the same traditions, right? So I think they're constructed on the same ideas, basically. Yes.
Was someone else? No? Okay. First of all, thank you for taking the time to translate this. I think it's really important. I remember being like 13, 14, and looking at these grimoires and not being able to understand them either, and asking also a lot of people at, Midwestern bookstores what it meant, and I couldn't get those answers either, so I appreciate that. And then my question is, you mentioned Agrippa, and I am starting to finally get into the 3 books of occult philosophy and breaking down those 3 sections like you did at the beginning, and you said it's the 3rd section, more ideal, like that's where you would most likely fit it in. So my question is, Solomon probably used the ideas of kind of like, in my head, if it's a 3rd section and if it's kind of like all-encompassing, and if it's an idea, it kind of had to relate to maybe the other 2, like the 72 angels of the...
Sure.
Yep. And then also, like, the different elements. So do you think that working with the talismans is kind of an... I hate to generalize it, but kind of like an all-encompassing...
I think in practice, so I think when we're talking about magic, we have all these, like, little categories because we need to be able to talk about it. But I think in practice, when we are actually working magic as magician, I think you're almost always working all 3 at once, right? So when I make talismans, I am pretty much always, like, I do think about the color and the ink and the paper and etc. And I always think about the astrological timing. I don't get too fussy with my astrological timing for pentacles, but you can. And I will say they do work better. Like, the ones I make in really careful elections, they have that power to them as well. and they've got that word power. So I think in practice, but I think that's true about Pentacles, and I think that's true really about anything. Like, I think the more kinds of magic you can sort of weave together in one working, the better. So I think a lot of when we talk about like categories of magic and vocabulary, I think that's really important for talking about magic. Here's something I think about a lot. In English, we have spent the entire history of the English language murdering anyone who said this stuff out loud. So, like, English does not have a robust vocabulary for talking about it. Like, if you're on Facebook, you'll see people are constantly arguing about what words mean, but that's because none of these words are actually the, like, good technical vocabulary we need to talk about things. We just make it up as we go along, right? But you only need that for, like, talking about magic to other people. When you're actually practicing it, I think those categories really don't matter so much at all.
Well, thank you for saying that, because I feel like because I'm definitely new to like more like occult spaces like this, and I think that when you're newer, you definitely want to have a good representation of what you're saying and to get your point across. And like, you're right, I think in more online spaces with so many different discourses, it matters, you know, in like contextually, but like, you know what I'm trying to say. So,
Absolutely.
Like, so I appreciate you explaining that as well.
I will also say, I think there is so much value. Like, those fights we're having, like, right now, I don't know if you guys are watching this, but at least my Facebook wall, like, literally this morning is blowing up, where people are arguing about, like, what counts as witchcraft and what is non-witchcraft magic, and I personally could not care less. But I think those conversations are really useful. I think talking about magic with other people, it, like, forces you to really examine what you are saying and get it, like, out of your head and into the world in a way that people who practice entirely by themselves, it's real easy to, like, think you know what you're talking about until you have to talk about it and you find out you do not know what you are talking, which is true about everything, not just magic, right? So I think that, like, there's a lot of value in that discourse, but I do think it's important to remember that it's a conversation about talking about magic. It's not really a conversation about magic qua magic. Yes?
What is your greatest practical result using Solomonic magic?
So that's a complicated question, because when the shit hits the fan, as we would say in America, right? When the chips are on the table, when it really matters, I'm almost never going to do just one kind of magic, right? So when it really matters, I'm doing Solomonic magic and also other kinds of magic. One practical result that I really like is about maybe 7 or 8 months ago, I was actually diagnosed with leukemia, which I did not tell my brother, so now he's looking at me. But don't worry, by the end of this story, I don't have leukemia anymore. So I got diagnosed with leukemia. It was a lot. It was a lot. I had right? And, like, I mean, quite definitively diagnosed, as it seemed to me. Like, I had a genetic test. It was like a whole thing, right? And I threw, you know, as one does, every piece of magic I could think of at that problem, including, right, I had people write pentacles on my body, which is my favorite way. Healing pentacles, that's what I normally do is, you know, if you, depending where you need to write them, just take a, like, Sharpie marker, a permanent magic marker, and draw them on your body, or, like, you know, on your back, you need to get somebody else to do it. Right? So I was covered in pentacles for a while, right? And I will say other kinds of magic as well, right? So I had a bone marrow biopsy. I don't know if you've ever had one of those. I do not recommend it. They drill a hole in your spine and it hurts a lot. They gave me fentanyl, which is a fabulous drug. I hope this isn't going to be triggering for anybody in recovery, but, like, there is a feeling of rainbow bliss that spreads through your body that is amazing. Like, I understand how people become addicted to that. And then they drilled a hole in my spine, and that ruined my high. It hurt quite a lot, right? And the results came back, and at least in the States, like, our results come back online. So you can see your results before you talk to the doctor. And they were very confusing. I didn't understand them. I called the person who did the test, the hematologist, and she, like, ducked my call for weeks. I called my doctor, and he, like, I made an appointment with my doctor, and he looked at them and looked at me and looked at them, and he's like, I'm sorry, this isn't my specialty, you're going to have to wait. So I finally went to the Mario Lemieux Center for Blood Cancers. Like, where I live, we happen to have a national center for blood cancer. So I was there for hours. Some doctor came in, opened my file. I guess they don't look at your file until they're there. So they opened my file, looked at it, and she's like, I'll be right back. An hour later, the head of the department came in, and, like, with this terrible look on his face, was like, I suppose your previous results were wrong. You seem fine. And we had a whole conversation where I had to be like, you seem upset that I don't have cancer. Like, the words you're saying are good, but your face is very bad. And he's finally like, I'm sorry, it's just so confusing. And I really wanted to be like, oh, bro, I'm a sorcerer. Like, that's what I'm sorry, this is confusing for you. Let's just agree to not think about it too hard and let it be the miracle that it is. So I would say that is perhaps my recent most spectacular result. But I mean, yeah, right? Thank you. So, like, maybe the previous test was just wrong. Like, maybe all those other blood tests were wrong, right? Like, I don't want to...
Or maybe a magic work.
Or maybe magic works. I will say, look, the best, as my BFF and co-magician, you know, is a martial artist, and he would certainly say that the best time to do healing magic is every day. You should just be working on that. But if you're fat and lazy like me, I will say that the best time to do healing magic is obviously every day. But in addition to that, for me, between, like, an initial diagnosis and, like, a confirmation, I think is a very, like, ripe period, right? Where things are still a little flexible and you can really, like, push into that. So for me, I really recommend, like, as soon as you get a diagnosis, just throw everything you can at it and get other people to do that too. But not everybody. Don't, you know, too much magic can muddy it up.
Yeah, I mean,
Final question.
I was going to say it's like the best time to do magic is when there's indecision or uncertainty.
Exactly.
And then you can change the results.
Mhm.
And I've done healing work for people when they're about to, like you say, about to go into surgery or this or that, but they're not really sure. And they're waiting, and because they fear the outcome, and you have to throw in a lot of positivity and change their mindset.
I agree.
And half the magic is done in the head, in their head, not mine.
Absolutely.
And the other part is in the astral and just completely
Absolutely.
change the
Yeah.
reality.
And there's a lot of research to support that like,
Yeah.
those sort of things do indeed make... So, okay, so I'm going to give one last tip, because I know I'm out of time. One last tip for healing magic. So my experience is doctors don't like to answer this question, but if you push them, they will. So I always ask, if I'm going to pray for a miracle, can you please explain to me exactly, in great detail, the specific miracle I should be praying for? And I do not leave their office until they have, like, drawn me a diagram of, like this thing here, like, oh, these cells, they look like this, but they should look like that. And again, they don't like to answer that question, but if you push, like, what miracle should I pray for, they will eventually, at least in the States, if you push them, they will answer that question eventually.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for coming. I'm going to be upstairs signing.
Let's do a sign.